Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for CVNM's Ask an Advocate legislative wrap-up session on this beautiful spring day. We've got snow, rain, and wind across the state, so typical New Mexico spring. Hopefully everybody's internet will hold. While we're getting everybody into the webinar, I'll just go over some of the Zoom setup for today. I'm Liz Lee, CVNM's Director of Philanthropy, and I'm the host for today. So while our panelists are speaking, all attendees will be muted. If you have any technical issues, drop a line in the chat function at the bottom of your screen, and that will we'll see that message there and hopefully deal with anything that you're experiencing. At the end of the speaking session, we'll have about 20 minutes for questions and answers. You can submit questions anytime using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen, and your questions will be answered either live or an answer will be typed directly into the Q&A function. We have a full program today and a very special guest speaker. So I'm going to turn it over to CVNM's Executive Director, Denise Foster, for introductions and get us into the program. Denise?
Thanks so much, Liz. And thanks to everyone else who has joined us today. We really, we appreciate you. We appreciate your support as a conservation voter. We couldn't do this work without you. So this is for you. We're going to give you a behind the scenes in-depth look at what happened in the legislative session this year. We are incredibly grateful and lucky to have our longtime conservation champion and President ProTem, Mimi Stewart, joining us in a little bit to talk about her view of the session. And we also have members of our advocacy team here today. For those of you who are new to Conservation Voters New Mexico, we work year-round on policy, statewide policy and federal policy as well to protect our air, land, water, wildlife, and communities. And this session was no exception. We were in the building full time. We track all the bills that come through to see if they have an environmental impact or an impact on voting and democracy. We then analyze those bills and we choose the ones that have the most impact for our legislative agenda. Our legislative agenda provides an analysis and a recommendation for our legislators on how to vote on those bills. We have a short fact guide so they can look quickly at it, or we have a more comprehensive analysis of all the bills. This year, we had 137 bills that we were tracking. 75 of those made it onto our legislative agenda, and 19 made it through both chambers and are awaiting signature on the governor's desk. So overall, this session, we had some huge wins, transformative wins, like the Land of Enchantment Legacy Fund that the advocates are going to discuss. This is the largest investment in conservation in New Mexico history, with $100 million now going into dedicated conservation funding that will allow us to leverage federal funds that we've been leaving on the table. A big win there, big win on voting, big voting bill got through this year. And at the last minute, we also were able to stop a nuclear waste site down in the southern part of the state. But we did have our share of disappointments, as typically happens in the legislative session. Building on policy, we know takes a long time. And we did not do as well on getting climate policy through to really address the root cause of climate change and reduce emissions. We'll talk a little bit more about what happened there when we get to the next section of the hour here. So once we distribute our legislative agenda, we keep track of every single vote on all of those pieces on our legislative agenda. So after the session, we can determine a score for each of the legislators. And that score goes into our CVNM scorecard. You can log on to it on the website, and you can look at how your legislator is doing. We even have all the bills there to show you how they voted and what was in the bill. So you can see how your people are doing in there. We use those scores to inform our endorsement process. We also work in elections. We endorse candidates, pro environmental climate and climate champions for endorsement. And in this upcoming election in 2024, all 112 seats in the House and Senate will be up for election. That's 70 House members and 42 Senate members. So we will be looking at that and hopefully being able to continue to get more champions in those chambers. We currently do have a pro-conservation majority in the House and the Senate, but we want to keep working towards even a stronger one. I'm proud to have my hardworking advocacy team here today. They're the ones beating the hallways and the committee rooms. They're in that building, full time with the legislators, working really hard on environmental legislation. And they are going to dig in a little more to what happened. We have an expanded team over the last couple of years that are able to actually work in their own specific expert areas. We have climate and energy. We have water quality, water quantity. We have land, water, and wildlife expert. We have experts on pollution and oil and gas. And together, they're all working really hard to make sure we can continue to make progress on climate change and on environmental issues in the state. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our longtime Political and Policy Director, Ben Shelton.
There's a lot to cover. I'm not going to cover it all. In past years, we had a smaller advocacy team, so it was easier to cover everything that we worked on because there's just so much that 1 to 3 people can do in a legislative session. This year, with the size of our team, we were tracking at different junctures 137 different bills. We had a 70+ bill agenda, so we were working all over the building on such a broad array of things that we're just not going to be able to cover it all here today, unless we were to sit here and just sort of read you a list of bills, which would probably not be very interesting. Things to keep in mind about this session, just by way of lay of the land. This is the second term for Governor Lujan Grisham. The second term is always different. It's an interesting shift, and it depends, you see a shift really in governors in the second term, and it really depends from governor to governor what that looks like. We think that it's fair to say that unless you're very clear that the sitting governor is going to be running for something else once that second term ends for them, that they're a little bit different in terms of the political pressure that they respond to. I don't get the impression, I don't know, but I don't get the impression right away that there's an obvious next step that this governor is looking for. So coming into the second term, she is not looking at a re-election. So it can change. You can get a little bit of a shift, maybe a better idea of what the personal priorities of this governor are. Coming in 2019, she had to be re-elected. In front of her, she had people she needed to keep happy. She had corners to keep clean politically. And that's not necessarily the case now. So that kind of changed the dynamic a little bit. The other thing that changed the dynamic in the legislature this year was we had a brand new speaker come in. Speaker Egolf stepped down to spend some more time with family. And Representative Javier Martinez, who would be the majority floor leader, stepped into the speaker's room and immediately began with a really significant committee shakeup. He changed out the chair of House Appropriations. He did a lot of shifting around in other committees. I think it's safe to say that between committees and leadership, his team is very much in place. He sort of made no bones about getting his people in place in the House, which changed the dynamic for us, certainly in the House a lot, for everyone really. So that affected the way things worked. The final thing, and I think that was a big one, and maybe less for folks like President ProTem, but more for advocates, this is really the first fully in-person, sort of doors wide open session that we've had since 2020. we had a short session in 2020, and then COVID shut everything down, and we were completely virtual in the 2021 long session. We were mostly, I would say, I think mostly virtual from a public and advocate standpoint in 2022 in the short session as well. So it was a very different year in a lot of ways. I think a lot of people, I think I'm projecting, I had forgotten what a stressful, like how exhausting it can be to actually be in the building and moving around all day long, versus doing it in a virtual session where your life is sort of, it's all written kind of in front of you for the most part. You're on phone calls, and it's kind of a little bit more, I guess that felt a little bit more manageable in retrospect. It didn't feel manageable at the time. So it was a very different session. I think all of those things contributed to it feeling very, very different. As Denise mentioned, a lot of bills did get through from that we were working. A lot of bills got through generally. I think it was, and people are describing it as a very sort of overall productive session. And I think that's probably pretty accurate. A lot of stuff and a lot of priorities, sort of progressive priorities, did wind up getting some forward progress. Not everything. I think there's some unchecked boxes. I think there's obviously a lot of appetite to continue to work on paid family medical leave. And things like that. But we did get some good things across the line from the environment and conservation perspective. Not so much on climate. I'll touch on that in a second. Greg will talk about this more in just a minute, but Senate Bill 9, the Land of Enchantment Legacy Funds, is a huge deal. This is something that has been a multi-year effort to get a permanent conservation funding source in the state. The way that we did it is I think is pretty neat. Greg's going to talk a little bit more about it, how that looks and what we're going to do with that hopefully going forward. We supported the Voting Rights Act, House Bill 4, which expanded, it did a lot of things. It included the Native Voting Rights Act and all sorts of important things in there that are going to make the ballot more accessible to more New Mexicans. We have always said that, one of the main ways that New Mexicans stand up and protect our environment is at the ballot box. It's one of the primary ways we do it. And it's something that happens consistently because everybody in the state, every corner of the state engages with their environment, engages with public land in a way that's not necessarily true everywhere. So having that ballot engagement is really, really key. Denise mentioned the bill, what we kind of called the whole tech bill. It was a bill that said the state kind of officially didn't approve of citing nuclear waste, what they are calling a temporary nuclear waste storage facility in Southeast New Mexico. The trick, of course, with temporary nuclear waste storage is that temporary gets permanent real fast. Once that hot potato stops moving, it's hard to get it moving again. So I think that that was a really big one. Our thanks to Jeff Steinborn and the CVNM's Doug Micklejohn for working on that. The budget year was really interesting. There was a huge surplus, but there was a very hard line held on making sure that surplus was not treated as recurring funds, which is always the case with surpluses generally, because you just don't know what the price of a barrel of oil is going to do. And although it's been getting better in recent years, we are still pretty significantly dependent for at least the surplus parts and sort of budget growth in the state on the oil and gas industry. I say it's getting better because some of the tax reforms in the last few years have actually started to slowly change the dynamic. But it's a slow process. The budget process was strong. I think that we got, Greg will talk about Senate Bill 9. We got that funded fairly robustly. There were some big one-time expenditures for things that I think are strong, are going to have really positive impact in the state. And hang on, I have those here. We got some money in the Strategic Water Reserve. We got some good investments in water sort of infrastructure generally. There's money in there to look at getting the state's water permitting program back. Right now, a discharge permit, if you want to discharge into water, you go apply for a permit in Dallas. And then maybe somebody from Dallas will come out occasionally and make sure that you're in compliance with it. It's not a great system. So looking forward to changing that in future years, but we got some funding for that. So the budget, I think, was a strong process. I think we still have a big question to ask, which is how do we start funding our environmental regulators in a really robust way to not just sort of meet what their obligations are statutorily now to protect the environment under existing law. But we needed them to start doing more. We need them to start thinking about greenhouse gas emissions and limiting emissions attributable to climate change. So all of that is going to require either a significant growth or a significant change in sort of what they do and what their mission is. So that's still problem to solve. I don't know that's just a straight dollars and cents problem. I think that's a structural issue. I think that we got to keep working on that. We did get very late in the session the tax package finalized, and there's some great stuff for conservation in there, particularly geothermal energy, for those of you who are interested in geothermal, as well as electric vehicles. So there's sort of good news from the tax perspective there, that there'll be some sweeteners in that. Denise mentioned that we didn't kind of get what we wanted done on climate change. The reason this feels really notable is because this is the first long session of the Lutheran Grisham administration where we've not been able to work with the governor to get things across the line that really put a dent in climate change. In 2019, we were able to pass the Energy Transition Act and get the state's electricity generation sector on a much better sort of trajectory. In 2021, we did community solar, and we got a key piece of language out of statute that was stopping us from tackling climate change, particularly in the oil and gas sector. By the environment department, so we got these things done in 21. And this is the first year where we can really kind of say, we took the swing, we gave it absolutely everything we had, thanks in large part to President ProTem Stewart. And we weren't able to get stuff across the line. We're not discouraged by that. We don't feel particularly defeated or anything like that. That's just not the way we are. But I think it's notable that, for the sake of just holding ourselves and others accountable, that we be honest about what happened there. But what close calls we did have were thanks in large part to great leadership from people like ProTem Stewart. So without further ado, because I think I'm over time, I would love to just give the floor over to the President Pro Tem and just have her. She has been doing this work. She has been in the legislature long enough to sort of see the cyclical nature and sort of the peaks and valleys of some of this stuff. And I think it's just a great perspective. And thank you again for joining us, Madam President, to talk about that. So your President Pro Tem, Stewart.
Well, thank you so much, Ben, Denise, everyone. CVNM usually has the best lobbying of any environmental group. You're the most trusted. You're the ones that don't lie to us. You're the ones that understand the political process. So I just have to start off by thanking you all. And what a great rundown that you've both done. So I'm glad you're not frustrated and you're not giving up. I'm a little frustrated. I'm not giving up either, but I thought that we would have a significant climate change bill. I kept hearing my chief of staff, Sanders Moore, used to be one of you all, is just the best. And she went to all these meetings for months between the governor, and her two agencies, so their most responsible, Environment Department, Energy and Minerals, was Sarah Cottrell Probst and James Kenney, other environmental groups, and the hated industry, and could not come to any kind of an agreement at all on what to do about codifying the governor's really great executive order that came out of 2019, with a bang, that we all want to codify because of the problems with the change of administration that will happen, luckily not till 2026. I got that right. So I kept waiting for it. And of course, I was very well of HB 188, which really is the impacted communities bill to be attached to the climate bill. And then, it fell apart. Those negotiations fell apart. I'm fairly certain who the culprit is. I just think the industry continues to not want to put anything in statute regulating them, certainly not putting a hard cap on emissions because they don't want to do that. They don't think they can. Sorry, I'm dissing on the industry, but that's how I'm feeling today. So, we finally came up with Senate Bill 520. Some people call it a dummy bill. I call them generic bills or emergency bills. So it was crafted by CVNM, other people in the environmental community, kind of probably without the industry. They just came unglued with it. They all stood up, and we had all these environmental groups stand up against it. Why? They said because it didn't fund the two administrative departments well. Well, that wasn't the bill to do it. That was not a reason to not support this bill. We were in front of conservation, and they had one Democratic member missing. I heard later that the Republicans on that committee were texting the Republicans on the committee that senator was at to try to ask more questions to keep him out of the room. I don't know if that's true. The legislature is filled with paranoia. So I was very disappointed that bill stuck there tied with, one of my colleagues just saying, well, it's got no teeth. It has no teeth. And I'm sure you all complained that it had no teeth, but at least it was a beginning, and it would do codification of the governor's executive order with regards to emission limits, and we need that. So that was just very disappointing. The demise of House Bill 188 was very disappointing. But we did get that Land of Enchantment Legacy Fund. It's just a beautiful thing we did. And of course, you all have mentioned other things. But I am not happy with our lack of work on climate change. And that has just got to start changing. And I am no longer interested in waiting for the industry to say okay on a bill. We just need to move forward without them. And I am very willing to do that. Disappointed, but not defeated. Seems to be my go-to quote these days, that we just need to continue to work on these issues. I'm grateful for your organization because you do it all the time, and very willing to move forward with you. And also happy to answer questions.
Awesome. Thank you, Senator. So I think we're joined by a couple of our advocates who are just in the building every day and leading the charge on some of these different issues. I would love to turn it over to Sammy Cow, our climate and energy advocate, to run through some of the many bills dealing with climate change and energy transition that I didn't talk about. So Sandy, take it away.
Thank you, Ben. Yes, like Ben was previously saying, there was a lot going through the legislature, so I'm not going to touch on everything, but please feel free to ask in the Q&A. So unfortunately, yeah, this session was not the most successful when it came to climate issues, but we were still able to get some really good climate related bills passed, and some very important conversations started on bills that will be introduced again in better and stronger forms in upcoming sessions. This year, we were finally able to get a handful of tax incentives in the final tax package, like Ben mentioned. So New Mexicans can look forward to tax credits for EV purchases, renewable energy storage systems, and geothermal energy systems. We were also able to get a bill passed to house a renewable energy office in the state land office, which will help fund our schools through leasing land for renewable energy projects. And having a permanent renewable energy office will ensure the longevity and success of the renewable energy industry in our state, instead of allowing it to fluctuate with differing administrations who might be more or less friendly to the industry. Most exciting, in my opinion, is getting the Geothermal Center and Fund. That was SB 8 and or House Bill 365. That will kickstart our state's investment in geothermal energy, which will provide another sustainable avenue to achieve our goals to be emissions-free by 2050. We had a handful of high priority bills that unfortunately did not pass. Like Madam President mentioned, most notably was House Bill 188, the Economic Transition Division. We worked very hard all year with our Power for New Mexico team to craft this piece of legislation that would have kickstarted deep and early investment into frontline communities in New Mexico who are currently reliant on the fossil fuel industry. And this bill would have created an Office of Economic Transition in the Economic Development Department. And this division would have been responsible for allocating state and federal funds to frontline communities and for the purposes of health and unemployment insurance, as well as facilitate programs for educational opportunities in the clean energy industry. I'm sorry. House Bill 188 garnered a lot of strong support, and it passed out of its first committee, which was House State Government Elections and Indian Affairs. And almost immediately after passing out of committee, we realized we were competing with 5 other bills that were also looking to create new divisions under the Economic Development Department. So we were told by the administration that we needed to work together to consolidate. And unfortunately, this resulted in the creation of House Bill 12, the Advanced Energy Technology Act. And this bill, unfortunately, combined all of the great Economic Transition Division language with nuclear energy and blue hydrogen development. So in the end, this wasn't a bill that had broad support from either Power for New Mexico or the larger climate coalition, and the bill never made it into its first committee. Fortunately, though, House Bill 2, the budget bill, did include a fund for economic transition, so that is one step in the right direction. Other high priority bills that we hope to see reintroduced again next year and the years coming are HB 218, that was the low income utility rate bill, and Senate Bill 418, the Oil and Gas Reform Act. Both bills just were not able to move through the legislature fast enough, but we hope that we can have them reintroduced next year. And with that, I will pass it on to Greg, who has more exciting news on his success in the public lands arena.
Thank you, Sammy. Good morning, everyone. Greg Peters, advocate for lands, water, and wildlife here at CVNM. And as Denise had mentioned, and Ben as well, this was a transformative session for conservation. Our signature Lands, Water, and Wildlife Bill, Senate Bill 9, the creation of legacy and permanent funds for conservation, passed the legislature and is now awaiting the governor's signature. And we're anticipating this in the coming days and invite you all to join us in celebrating once it's official. This, as Denise mentioned, represents the biggest single investment in conservation in the state's history. It's an innovative piece of legislation born out of previous iterations. It's an example of how bills can take time to develop. We've been engaged in and led multiple attempts in achieving this big goal of large-scale conservation funding. But we were finally able to build the house, so to speak, and begin furnishing it through initial appropriations this session. So what is it? The Land of Enchantment Legacy Fund. It funds 10 programs that will provide immediate injection into programs that we know work across a number of state agencies, funding the protection and restoration of our lands, water, wildlife, and cultural heritage. It also sets a second permanent fund that will fund the legacy fund once the corpus reaches a certain level, similar in the architecture to the Early Childhood Investment Fund. So the way we view it is the legacy fund is the wallet, so to speak. Gives us 2 to 5 years to get money on the ground to agencies for them to have stable revenue, planned projects, and effectively leverage federal dollars. The permanent fund is the savings account. As it grows, it will continue to accumulate interest, which will ultimately fully fund the legacy fund. We know these programs work. We know there's a need. We know there's a demand. And we know that there's a ready workforce. And we know that there are plenty of federal dollars. Many of these programs have competitive bid processes that dwarf themselves in terms of what they're able to actually fund. And there's a tremendous interest and demand for increased funding for them. This bill was elegantly done. It was ripe. We were ready. We needed it. And it was broadly bipartisan, including support from agriculture groups, private landowners, conservation and public lands advocates, wildlife groups, including sportsmen and non-consumptive advocates, broad water policy interests, acequias, land grants, and tribes. The point of this initiative is that there's something for everyone. We all want our personal favorite priority programs to get more funding, and we all advocate for them. But our strength this year, this time, was in unity, which really fueled our momentum and built support within the legislative body. We had an initial ambitious ask of $350 million to ensure that we could begin accruing interest immediately, but ultimately fell short with a $100 million investment spread between the two funds. This is common during complex budget negotiations with many interests represented. But rest assured, we will be coming back next year for additional advocating and requests for appropriations and pushing for the continued funding for these successful programs. Not only did SB 9 pass, but a large package of lands, wildlife bills, and water bills did as well, creating a path forward for funding and action across the state, again, supported by diverse stakeholders and a bipartisan commitment in the building. This included a priority bill for Senator Stewart, the establishment and funding of wildlife corridors across the state, which was a multi-year effort amongst advocates, state agencies, and committed legislators. In addition to things such as Forestry Act amendments, targeted procurement exemptions to get more resources invested on the ground, wildfire mitigation and fire recovery, water system resilience and security planning, and modernizing the Game and Fish Department, which we're hoping will be a first step towards agency and commission modernization. What made SB 9 successful? Well, we brought everybody together. The administration gave the green light to Secretary Cottrell Probst and MNERD to begin work early and bring people together. We brought all of the state agencies into a room with advocates and stakeholder communities that had skin in the game. We had more opportunities for success and the time we needed to get it done, which was critical. We were able to solve problems, address issues heads on, and build a robust coalition. Now with us here, less than a week removed from the session, I would like to encourage everybody to thank the governor and the administration, thank the agencies, and thank the sponsors for investing in conservation and making this a priority. We'd also like to thank all of the organizations that led on so many of these bills and the legislators who so ably sponsored and defended their legislation. It's been an honor and to partner and learn from all of these groups. But most importantly, we want to thank you so much for your engagement and your activism during this legislative session. Your calls, your emails, participation in committee hearings, in person or remote, contact with legislators, including responses to action alerts, and intelligence to us. It's always great to hear, people in districts, we learn a lot from them. It's all really made a difference. So just want to, again, in closing, express our gratitude and appreciation for all of your work. And with that, I'll hand it back to you, Ben.
Greg, so that kind of concludes our little presentation part of it. I see some questions stacking up in the Q&A box, and I think I will kick it over to Michael to start farming out some of those questions.
Yeah, we have a question from Tom Solomon asking how much the environmental agency budgets, that would be the Environment Department and the Energy, Minerals, and Natural Resource Department, how much those budgets were increased, and is there hope for improved enforcement for emissions violators because of that?
Okay, I'll take a crack at that because I was the one looking kind of at a higher level of the budget, and then I think Senator Stewart, I think I'll just let you raise your hand too. I think that's they both saw some sort of modest increases. The issue with the Environment Department's budget has always been that the secretary feels like his operating budget is getting cross-programmed from some of the cleanup funds. It was what they call restricted funds that he can only use for certain purposes. So the improvement, it didn't reflect the budget surplus. I'll put it that way. That with that said, I think there were some signs for optimism, certainly in the process. In years past, and I hope I'm not going to get too wonky here, but when the executive and legislative budgets go to House Appropriations Committee, which is their first stop, the rule of thumb has always been that the House Appropriations Committee for every operating budget will just take the lower number. Whoever proposed less is what they take and kind of plug in. We saw that with the environmental regulators confounded this year. Chair Small, Vice Chair Dixon did not do that. They passed operating budgets out of House Appropriations that were actually higher for, I would say, for MNERD than either budget had initially proposed. So he took those numbers and bumped them up, which is a great sign. I think a good thing that we can build off of going forward. So there's some reason for optimism, but yeah, I wouldn't say there was a huge leap. And I'll ask Senator Stewart to fill in the gaps there.
Well, I agree with you, Ben. The problem always is that these two agencies, when they come before the finance, finance looks at vacancies. And I wish they would stop doing that, because that's such a problematic thing that they look at. If you come and you've got 20% vacancies and yet you're asking for another 20%, the finance people just don't like that and they can't get their heads around it. Now, I know that for both of those departments, Energy and MNERD, we went above what they requested, above what the governor requested, above what LFC requested. Was it enough? No, because both of those departments are the ones required to do the monitoring of our new methane rules, et cetera, and they don't have enough people. But when you go to the finance people and you suggest more, then they whine and say, we've increased it 17%. Even though they needed 40, they're proud of the 17%. So is it better? Yes. Is it where we need to be? No. Do I have an idea of how to fix it? Not yet, but I've been trying to do it for years. And just because I'm the ProTem does not mean that I can say what's in the budget. Apparently, I tried to do it all session, but those finance committees are just dug in. It's got to be done in the interim with LFC. We will have new people on LFC. We will have a new chair. We will have a new vice chair. And I really believe it's in the interim that we have to get them to understand what kind of work we're requesting these two agencies to do and not funding them to do it.
There's another question, which I believe Senator Stewart, you could probably answer, which is how much can get done in a short session? And I'm guessing this is regarding trying to get, another big climate bill through, but you can answer in general also.
If we're ready to go, it will be fun. It will be fine. We can do it at the beginning. But, I didn't get Senate Bill 520 until a week and a half before the end, or maybe 2 weeks. And part of that was because of the lack of agreement on the climate bill with the administration. I mean, everyone said that they wouldn't do a climate bill unless the administration, those two agencies and the governor was on board. And they basically never got on board. Now, they were on board with Senate Bill 520, which was scaled down quite a bit, but the industry wasn't. So if we work in the interim, if we can work on LFC to get more funding, if we can manage to get a climate bill, and I hate to say it this way, but we have to have a climate bill that works for the environment, irrespective of what the industry is saying. We have to focus on that. And if we have it ready, we might be able to make a go of it with the governor.
Great, thank you. There's a very, I think, quick question and then a question that maybe has a longer answer. So I'll do the short one first, which was, does somebody know which bill funded the Department of Agriculture to provide funding to the soil and water conservation districts?
That probably was just in the budget, not in a bill.
Okay.
I think Senate Bill 9 did have a portion that went straight to soil and water conservation districts, so they will get some funding through that land of enchantment fund, but that's not general funding for Department of Ag. That is fairly specific to SWGs.
Agreed. Yeah, Senator Stewart was correct. I mean, it came out of HB2, but also one of the many state programs being funded by SB 9 included programs under the umbrella of the Department of Agriculture, including the Healthy Soils Act, funding for soil and water conservation districts, as well as noxious weed management.
And thank you very much. So it's a question about SB 520, the climate bill. It was focused pretty narrowly on putting some rules and policies into statute. Why is that important? And what other rules and statutes need to be dealt with related to getting a zero emission economy in New Mexico?
Well, I'll take a first stab at it. We want to codify the good, solid executive order that the governor did when she first got elected. She set standards for how much emissions will allow for the next 30 years. We want to put those in statute. Executive orders can be undone and forgotten about from one administration to the other. So we want to put those clean standards in the statute so that we all have to work toward them. And, you know, we should put consequences also. We should put the type of fines or whatever we need to ensure that those are met. And that's a hard thing to do. Still what we need to do.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think nothing is promised. You know, we've got the governor who is committed to these targets via executive order, and we've got her for 3.5 really more years. And once we get to that 2026 point, we don't know. We have obviously a lot of hopes that we're going to have another, climate focused governor, but we don't know that we get that. So putting that in statute is really important for that. And also because, you know, the 2045 and 2050 and all these sort of like target years get thrown around, but the big one is 2030. I mean, really in the next 6 to 7 years is when we really have to do a lot of this work. And 2026 to 2030 is going to be a hugely important window for continuing to reduce emissions from all sectors of the state. So having this in statute is really important for that reason. And it also sort of sets us off on the right trajectory in terms of what was the question? What other rules and statutes need to be dealt with? You know, I think we need to have, it's the same problem they have at the federal level, which is who's got authority to specifically go and regulate greenhouse gas. I think that authority needs to be kind of clear right now to sort of define that as a pollutant and make it very clear that we have pretty broad authority as a state to go out and regulate this stuff. It kind of gets it it seems a little wonky and a little bureaucratic, but this is stuff that winds up being hugely important once everyone gets sued, which is inevitable, I think, on a lot of this. And making sure that your granted authority is clear and strong is really, really key. So I think those are, and that granted authority builds off of those targets and builds off of that mandate. So I think it's important to get that sort of foundational piece in place.
Great, thanks. There's another question that involves the LFC, the Legislative Finance Council, about this is from Tom Solomon. Geothermal had 25 million appropriation for grants and loans stripped from the final HB 365, and he'd like to know how the LFC can be convinced to put those into the 2024 budget.
Just prepare a good presentation and go in front of the LFC more than once if you can. Find the LFC staffer that deals with this issue and meet with them ahead of time. Get them to understand why you need this money, and then get the chair to put you on a presentation at the LFC. A lot of people go to the LFC now that we're allowing any legislator that serves on a finance committee to show up and get per diem, even though you may not have a vote. These committees are more and more robust, and you just got to go to the source. And that's it, LFC.
Thank you. There's a question. It's a small question. What can we do about oil and gas revenue becoming even more important to the state's budget?
You know, I could take a crack at this because I think probably Senator Stewart has answered this one 50 times in the last calendar year. Part of it overall, you just got to continue to diversify the economy. That's the meta level message. You have to continue to try to raise the tide, continue to float all boats. That's at a high level, which is kind of a frustrating thing I understand to hear. But yes, things like film and clean energy and outdoor recreation and food products and healthcare and all this kind of stuff is important to continue to invest in, because that's just how we build a tax base that's not just oil and gas. I think I can get more specific, because I think the answer actually to this, I think in a very short, narrow way, is a little bit counterintuitive. And I think that part of the answer, we don't get as much in royalties from oil and gas on state lands as Texas does. We get less barrel of royalty out of the Permian than Texas does. So depending on what's, go 5 miles across the border and they're getting a better deal than we are in New Mexico. And the reason that's important for reducing dependence on that revenue stream, even though it seems like it would do the opposite, is because right now we do really well as a state, really when the industry is growing and booming, when there's real rigs, when there's growth, when they're sort of like in boom times, that's when we do great. When they're just kind of in status quo, for us, it looks very similar to when they're contracting. So, it's not just that we're dependent on the oil and gas industry in a certain state, which is doing this. And if we can get royalty rates up and start getting better rates per well, then we kind of start getting a little more stability in terms of the revenue that's flowing to the state from not necessarily an exploding number of drill rigs and a growing number of wells. So I think that's actually really important to sort of help manage that trajectory is, and we've heard the land commissioner, Commissioner Garcia Richards say this, is we've got to get the royalty rates on par with our neighbors, because we don't get as good a deal, and there's no good reason for it. We capture between 12 and 20% for royalties of the receipts. That's, and generally speaking, we're kind of capped at 20%. Generally speaking, it's in the 12-15% rate, depending on how productive the well is. In Texas, that rate starts at 25%. That's the beginning. And if there's there's sweeteners that'll move it down as low, maybe as 20%, which is our max. If depending on production and how quickly they get into production, all that kind of stuff. So even just getting us on par with some of our neighbors in that way would be a really key one. As I think it's also key to continue to sort of work on capture and reducing leakage and waste. I think that a lot of the gas and oil, and particularly gas, methane that we should be capturing and getting our fed of, we just lose through waste. The methane rules and the ozone precursor rules of the last few years will help with this, but it's an ongoing issue. But that's my sort of two-parter answer to how we get that done.
And didn't we have a bill to do that did not pass?
We did. We had a bill that would have modernized a lot of the oil and gas acts to create a much better rulemaking administrative space to promulgate rules around the Oil and Gas Act. Our friends at Western Environmental Law Center led on that bill, and we weren't able to get that done. And that one, I think I could see coming back in the short session next year, because I think there were parts of that had a lot of support. And there's I think probably 80% of that was supported by a lot of important stakeholders. And I think that if you think that 80% put that into a bill, I want to run that next year.
And I think that probably will be germane, that it won't need a message because of the increase in fees.
I think that based on the reception for a lot of that bill, we might actually get a message if we need it. Sorry, Sandy.
No, you're fine. I also remember Senator Tallman had a bill to increase royalty rates for oil and gas revenue. Unfortunately, was not heard on the House floor.
Yeah, I could never figure out how the House was deciding what bills to hear, because it was definitely a decision that they made every day in the last 2 weeks in particular. So.
There are not any more questions right now, I don't think. If anybody has any, feel free to put them into the Q&A or the chat, whatever's handy. Otherwise, maybe we can sum up.
Well, you know, this last conversation has made me think of, all right, well, look at those bills that died on the House floor that we really need, and go and have a conversation with the leadership in the House. Do the same thing in the Senate, although I can't think of any bill that was left on the Senate floor that we needed for the environment. I could be wrong. I'm still tired of the whole place. So I would start there for CVNM and your advocates, get them to understand that this is sort of this multi-prong effort where you have to get to different folks. But speaking to the leadership of why they didn't put those bills on, I think is an important conversation.
That actually feeds into a question that popped up while you were speaking, Senator, and that is, how does the new leadership impact our work moving forward?
Well, I mean,
in the House especially.
The House especially. I mean, there are a lot of really good environmental progressives in the House. They're not all like that. And they have elected more conservative members now than they have in the past. You can see that in some of the, you know, the killing of some of these bills. Paid family medical leave is one of them. So I really think it's important that you focus on those House environmental members to get them as a block to move these bills forward. If you remember, in the House, they've had at least 2 interims where this group of women, mostly progressives, worked on broadband one year, and this year on modernizing the legislature. I think a group of environmental activists ought to be able to be gotten together to go to the leadership to demand more action on these environmental bills. It's going to take that. I mean, I think overall the leadership is good, is progressive, and is focused on the environment. Gail Chasey and I have worked together for 25 years. You know, before she became the majority leader, she carried my Wildlife Trafficking Act and my Wildlife Corridors Act. You know, certainly Rena, who we don't really know yet very well as a legislator, is an environmentalist. I don't know about Ray Laura. And the speaker is just kind of showing who he is right now. But I would question him on why these environmental bills were not called up in the last few days. So it's just an important conversation to have with them.
Yeah, thank you. Well, thank you, Madam President. I would say just a huge, as we come off the session, because we are so close to it, just the gratitude that we feel for you and what you do, of Senator Worth, Senator Hamblin. I mean, these are really the rocks that the church was built on in a big way. On the House side, certainly Chair McQueen,
Yeah.
Representatives Ortez and Rubio. I mean, the work that folks do that no one ever really sees on a lot of the policy is just huge. So that, I think, brings us to just about the end of our time. Thank you guys all for attending. We are going to keep building. Senator Stewart alluded to a couple of good ideas for the interim that I think that we are in various processes of putting together the plans and starting to run with around interim committees, budget engagement, building coalitions, things like that. So we will be in all of that. As we move forward, we obviously continue to rely tremendously. I mean, our strength is in our membership, and the fact that folks are willing to reach out to their legislators and hold them accountable. You can find our scorecard, our CVNM scorecard will be out as soon as we can possibly get it out. It's a big, complicated document. We shoot for the summer, and sometimes we hit getting it out in the summer, and sometimes we don't. But please continue to use that as a way to track bills that are moving, track the things that are moving, and hold your legislators accountable. That's a really, really important piece for us. And then stay engaged. Keep an eye on interim committees. We still have, maybe unfortunately, we still have a citizen legislature. I think I would love to see a paid professional legislature, but that's a conversation for a different day. We still have a citizen legislature, which means that they are your neighbors, they are your friends, they are your peers. Please continue to not be shy to reach out to folks, let them know how you feel, connect, support up champs, hold people accountable where they need it. That is the backbone, and that is the mandate and the political strength that Greg and Sammy and Denise and Michael and everybody, all of us carry into the Roundhouse and use to try to make change. So thank you for that and for the support.
Can I say one more thing?
Please.
It's time to donate to CVNM. I've just done so myself while I'm sitting here listening to Ben. So anybody online should be contributing. You're welcome.
Thank you, Madam President. I think that wraps our program for today. Everyone enjoy I think it just stopped snowing in Santa Fe. So if you're in Santa Fe, enjoy the rest of the day. Keep an eye out for action alerts. Thank you for the donation, Senator Stewart.
Thank you.
I think that brings us to the end. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much for what you do.